We continue our consideration of healing this month with a story about Jesus healing a foreign woman's child, a Syrophoenician woman's daughter. It's a story that stands out because it includes a verbal disagreement in which we hear Jesus saying something very unkind, something shockingly out of character when he compares the woman who approaches him to a dog. Jesus, who is our example, seems to deny this woman's request and her humanity, effectively slamming the door on her. But then, as we just heard in our scripture reading, the woman in the story responds by accepting the label of dog and using it to remind Jesus of God's boundless grace. And upon hearing her words, Jesus relents and heals her daughter. So this story feels a little different from most of what we read about Jesus, right? Kind of shocking because it exposes the possibility that Jesus himself was not always perfect. Or in some people's minds, something maybe even more uncomfortable, that God sometimes changes God's mind. The suggestion that Jesus is not always perfect is accepted traditional Christian doctrine, but it doesn't always sit well with us because we really want a perfect Jesus, because we think God is perfect. Yet traditional Christian theology says that Jesus is not just divine. Jesus is fully human, flesh and blood. To be fully human means that Jesus requires healing himself sometimes, that Jesus stumbles and falls on occasion, that Jesus also learns and grows. The growth and development of Jesus is obvious from the gospel stories, even if we don't always think about it that way. Right? Jesus was born a baby. He had to grow into a toddler, even a teenager. A lot of us modern folks have grown blind to this reality because we tend to view Jesus as perfect. But many stories about Jesus include an element of personal growth on Jesus' part. Jesus had to grow from a baby just like this baby right here. Jesus started just like we do. And this is part of traditional Christian doctrine, that Jesus is both fully divine and fully human. Fully human. It's a concept that defies human logic. How can Jesus be both? It would require that Jesus both be infinite and finite, perfect and flawed, always right, yet sometimes wrong. Being fully human assumes limitations, assumes imperfections, and it also assumes someone who needs healings, who needs to learn and grow. Jesus did not begin his earthly ministry until after he grew enough physically and spiritually so he could do so, and that took like 30 years. And even once Jesus started to teach and to heal, Jesus didn't stop being human. His growth continued, just as it does hopefully for each of us. Jesus is our example. Jesus, like us, would have good days and bad days. Jesus needed time to recharge, to renew himself. He needed a full night's rest. And with all the traveling that Jesus did, how busy he was, he struggled to find time to rest. The Bible tells us sometimes he had to go off alone to rest and pray. Other times Jesus had to lie low in order to catch a nap or spend some time with God in meditation. Our scripture text says Jesus did not want anyone to know he was in town. I mean, Jesus is in enemy territory. But even in the land of the pagans, he's already pretty well known. So this is an uneasy situation, a situation that's hard for us modern folks to comprehend because we live in such a different world. We don't live in an occupied country. Because Jesus, he's behind enemy lines in a region surrounding the city of Tyre. When Rome went to war against Israel, these folks, the people of the Phoenician city of Tyre, usually came along to help with the killing, to take part in the plunder of Israel. Tyre was a wealthy area, and it benefited significantly from the oppressed Jewish people via taxes and unfair market practices. In Tyre, there were many Greeks and Romans who lived off the taxes and the grain collected from the Jewish people. Effectively, these were people who were eating the bread grown by Jewish farmers, often leaving the farmers with little or none for their own families. They were abusers, predators, vicious wolves in the eyes of a Jew like Jesus. And not only did these people live off the work of the Jews, they're also, of course, outsiders. To a Jew living in that time, there's just two kinds of people, Jews and non-Jews. Jews believed themselves to be superior to non-Jews because they were the chosen people. And the Jews often referred to non-Jews as dogs. Not to single out the Jewish people. This kind of us versus them behavior was common to most people that time frame, and maybe is still common today. The very idea that the Jewish people were being ruled by these dogs is enraging, intolerable, just wrong in the eyes of the Jewish people, as it would be for any oppressed people. Of course, the Greeks and the Romans harbored the same us versus them thinking. The Greeks and Romans believed that they were the greatest, that their gods were more powerful, and they'd laugh at the Jewish people saying stuff like, hey, if your God was so powerful, how come our Roman army wiped you out? You had to surrender. If your God is so powerful, how come we have all your gold now and all your wealth? And they did. The Romans and Greek had much of what was once Jewish wealth. But it took a lot of force and power for the Romans and Greeks to keep the Jewish people in line. The situation was so intolerable that the Jews often revolted. And each time they revolted, they were forcibly put back in line, usually with help from soldiers from Tyre. The separation, the hate between the Jews and the pagan Greco-Romans was thick. How thick? Did you know that Jesus at no point undertook a mission to the pagans? He didn't. Jesus would occasionally heal a pagan, as he does in today's story, but when he does so from a distance. So in this context of oppression, force, violence, and resistance, Jesus, who is deep in enemy territory, tries to hide, makes no attempt to preach publicly, no attempt to preach to the dogs. They're not going to understand anyway. Don't put your jewels in front of swine. But despite his best efforts to find solitude, word gets out. Our scripture today focuses on a wealthy local woman of Tyre who finds Jesus and she kneels before him. Jesus' followers would have been enraged by this. How dare she? A pagan man would not normally approach a Jewish teacher, much less a woman. Jewish teachers and leaders were known for ignoring or verbally assaulting such people. They're not worth the time of day in Jewish culture for the reasons I've already mentioned and more. This woman knows this, but she is desperate for her child. Have you ever been desperate for a child before? I know many of you have been. There's something very wrong with this woman's daughter. Just describes as an unclean spirit or a demon. So she begs Jesus. She, a woman living off the grain and the sweat of Jewish farmers, she dares to act. She begs. And Jesus responds in a way that's less than kind. Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. She asks for healing, for a removal of a demon, and Jesus says no, referring to food and effectively calling her a dog. The children, the Jewish farmers, should get to eat first. They are the ones working in the fields. Jesus says, it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Now, we like to spiritualize this. The modern interpretation, the standard understanding of this passage is that Jesus is not talking about real food, but about his healing energy. and about spiritual food. But at the same time, it's not a stretch to assume that this woman and her family, in their day-to-day existence, were literally living off of food taken away from hungry Jewish families, Jewish farmers who could not always make the required tax payments. Maybe that's enough to make Jesus crack, to bring out justifiable anger in Jesus, the kind of anger that would eventually turn over tables in the temple. This was a rich pagan woman, likely living off the bread taken from Jewish farmers, asking Jesus to give her even more. So what are we supposed to make of this story? Is Jesus demonstrating that it's okay to say no to need, even to desperate need, when the person who's asking you for help has got one foot on your neck? Jesus indeed seems to say no to this woman. I'm tired, woman. You're mistreating my people. Get out of my way. Leave me alone. But it's not over yet. This woman is desperate for healing. She's not easily discouraged. And this foreign woman, this dog, she's got some spiritual depth. She's got some wisdom. She doesn't take Jesus' words as an insult. She doesn't say, "How dare you call me a dog?" And she doesn't respond passively either. "Sorry, Lord, let me just go home now." No. She doesn't do either of those things. She completely believes, she trusts at a deep and significant level that only Jesus can help. She's not going to give up. So she responds in a time-honored Jewish tradition of wrestling with God. If the human part of Jesus can't hear me, I'm going to the boss. I'm going to reach deeper than that. She responds in a way that Jesus himself often used. She responds to the analogy, to the story, with another story. She reminds Jesus, she responds, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." So this woman, she takes the outsider dog, the dog you despise, the dirty, low-down dog, and she transforms this dog, this underdog, into an insider dog, into the dog that lies at the master's feet. She says, "Hey, I may be a dog, but I'm your dog. Lord, do you hear me? I'm your dog. Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Now, in all fairness, these Greek and Romans were not eating the crumbs that fell from the children's table. They're taking the lion's share of the crops. Yet Jesus is impacted by this woman's response and the implications of her words. And Jesus then responds with words of healing. For saying that, okay, you may go. Your daughter is well. She's been healed. This woman's faith, her trust in Jesus is deep, and her understanding of spiritual truth seems to open Jesus' eyes. This woman, although we don't know her name, teaches us about how to argue, not only with God, but with our neighbors as well. No personal attacks, no strong statements, just a poignant analogy to get her point across. It's an approach we see Jesus use often in his parables. But in this case, it's Jesus who learns and grows, seemingly. That's one useful lesson from this story. We get to see an example from Jesus on how to lose an argument. An example of changing your mind when you're faced with another, perhaps more reasonable alternative. How often do we ignore facts, ignore data, and ignore people's feelings just so we can be right? Jesus doesn't do that. He doesn't get frustrated or flustered. He doesn't get defensive. He doesn't reject the woman any further. He doesn't try to backpedal his comments. He simply grants her request. Grants what she so desperately needs. And did you notice there are multiple healings in this story? We like to focus on the healing of the daughter, which is worthy of our attention. But consider the healing that Jesus himself experienced. The Bible time and again teaches us to overcome the prejudice and boundaries that separate people. Overcoming such boundaries is at the heart of loving God and loving your neighbor. In today's story, it's Jesus himself who has to reevaluate the boundaries that he had accepted, to drop the walls that he had taken for granted as part of his upbringing, that he'd learned from his life as a Jew living in an occupied land. I think this provides an excellent and useful example for us regular people, because we fall into the same trap. A perfect Jesus may not always be a practical example for imperfect people us, but a human Jesus is. A real human. Jesus was flesh and blood, just like us. And as it turns out, while Jesus didn't really do much outside of the Jewish community during his lifetime, this story helped to open a door to that world. This story, along with others, helped demonstrate that Jesus' ministry was for everyone, even though it started off as just for the Jewish people. The early teachers of the Christian tradition were mostly Jewish, and most of them were not shy about teaching and accepting everyone, particularly pagan dogs. Most of the early church was made of pagans. In the years after Jesus died and ascended, the Christian belief system spread quickly within the Greek and Roman worlds and throughout Europe, and this story helped facilitate that. This story showed that even people we may despise, that even people we may be used to seeing as less than human, may well be welcome at God's table too. This is important to our heritage as Christians, particularly those of us with European descent, because we're descendants of the Greeks and Roman world. Most of us were not children of Israel. We're descended, a lot of us, from the dogs in this story. And it's an important story because it still happens today, way too often, that we humans fall into the trap of looking down on other humans, of thinking other groups of people, because of where they come from, because of their ethnicity or their poverty, or because they are immigrants, are not somehow worthy of God's love as we are. This story teaches us that access to God and to God's grace is far more inclusive than we as people, that we as humans, that even sometimes Jesus himself may initially realize. And it's a message that we as an inclusive church try and work towards each day. And in case anyone asks, yes, we do include dog food in our pantry, too. So we do feed the dogs too.